Hello, welcome to the Abundance Workshops. I am Aisha McGowan, a professional cyclist for Live Racing Tech Find, and also the founder and program director of A Quick Brown Fox. A Quick Brown Fox works to build and create space and opportunities for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color to thrive in cycling and in the outdoors. Through programs, content, and initiatives, we continue to show how truly we believe that representation matters. Today, we are presenting Riding Back to Ourselves Together on mountain biking, mental health, and affinity spaces, led by Diana Para. This year, the Abundance Project is ecstatic to be a beneficiary of a Bronco Wild Fund grant and help further its mission to build a legacy of access to the outdoors. Bronco Wild Fund has teamed up with like-minded collaborators, agencies, organizations, and everyday heroes devoted to keeping the great outdoors great. A portion of the profits from every Bronco sold goes directly to Bronco Wild Fund collaborator initiatives like this one. Thanks so much to Bronco Wild Fund for helping us present the Abundance Workshops in 2023. Give a warm welcome to Diana Para and enjoy this presentation of Riding Back to Ourselves Together on mountain biking, mental health, and affinity spaces.
Thank you, Aisha. Good evening, and welcome to Riding Back to Ourselves Together. I'm Diana Parra. My pronouns are they, them, ella. I'm going to pull up my presentation here for you all. So let's get started. I like to always begin by telling you a little bit about me and what I do. I like to locate myself through an intersectional lens when having conversations about racial trauma in order to remember and remind you that I only speak for myself and my experience, even as I have additional training and expertise on some topics as a licensed therapist. There are many things I don't know, especially because of my privilege, and I most certainly do not have all the answers. I am a queer, non-binary immigrant who had the privilege of moving here from Colombia with documentation. I live and work in the unceded lands of the Cherokee and Yuchi peoples around Asheville, North Carolina. I am a non-Black, mestiza person of color currently exploring their relationship with their Indigenous roots and their white roots, who grew up and continues to benefit from the unearned privilege of proximity to whiteness and living in the middle class. I have invisible chronic illness, I am able-bodied, and benefit from the privilege of living in a smaller body. As an immigrant, I also have the privilege that comes with the way that I speak English. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor associate and a somatic therapist that specializes in working with queer, trans, and BIPOC adolescents and adults. My practice is called Condor Counseling and Somatics. As part of my ongoing training, I am in year 2 of the Somatic Experiencing Practitioner training, which I've been completing with a BIPOC affinity cohort. And I'm currently studying somatic abolitionism with Resmaa Menakem, who's the author of My Grandmother's Hands, through the Education for Racial Equity Communal Consultations program. I work and live as much as possible from an anti-oppressive lens, which basically means that I seek to recognize and unravel the systems of oppression within which we are embedded and through which we have been programmed. I love to do this work individually through my therapy practice, as well as communally. I'm also a mountain biker. I climb slowly and I take breaks often, but I live for the descents. I especially love chunky technical descents, and flowy trails keep growing on me. I also fall and hurt myself sometimes, so here's an action shot of a fall this past spring. I started riding in 2020 during the initial waves of COVID and in the first months of quarantine. On that very first ride, bikes became an important metaphor for life and for the way that I navigate and engage with it. Mountain biking continues to offer me deeply personal insights and lessons, but it has also become a means of communal healing for me. So now a little bit about writing in color. In 2022, last year, I started Writing in Color WNC, which is an organization that seeks to create intersectional affinity spaces for BIPOC of all genders, body sizes, and abilities to build skills and community within cycling. We have primarily served women, non-binary, trans, and gender diverse folks, though much of our programming is expanding to be inclusive of all genders. The primary goal of Writing in Color WNC, or RIC for short, is to lower the barriers to access the sport of mountain biking for BIPOC. The way we have been doing this is primarily through monthly affinity rides, where we have 2 to 3 trained BIPOC ride leaders who take a group on a ride through one of the local trail systems here in Western North Carolina. Most of these rides have been organized in collaboration with Dirt Skirts, a local nonprofit dedicated to getting women on bikes. One important part of making these rides financially accessible has been working with multiple bike shops locally, including The Hub in Brevard, Motion Makers in Cherokee, Trek in Asheville, and Epic Cycles in Black Mountain, so that these shops provide free bike rentals, usually full suspension bikes with all the bells and whistles, for each rider who needs one for the rides. We have started a gear library so folks also have access to a helmet if they need one, as well as packs and water bottles. We plan routes that are accessible for all skill levels. We navigate the trail systems, and we help folks feel more confident riding in the woods by becoming familiar with the trails. An important component of what we do is also educating folks on trail etiquette and on the principles of leave no trace. We have ridden in DuPont National Forest, Bent Creek Experimental Forest, the G5 Trails in Old Fort, Pisgah National Forest, and at Fire Mountain in Cherokee. As we ride, we stop at every intersection, we talk about the trail section we're about to ride, and we constantly remind our riders that an essential part of riding is walking your bike sometimes, so they need not feel any shame about walking. This winter, we also organize a free 6-week series on bike mechanic workshops, specifically for BIPOC, taught by 2 amazing women mechanics at the Hub. We have been doing weekly rides on Thursdays at rotating trail systems, although now this ride is going to become a twice per month ride because this work also needs to be sustainable for the folks organizing the space. So as we grow, we keep learning not just about how to best serve our community, but also about our capacity as ride leaders, facilitators, organizers, and humans with full lives. We have been collaborating with the North Carolina BIPOC Climbers, which is an organization to promote climbing among BIPOC that initially inspired me to start Writing in Color, and Riveter, a climbing gym and bike park, so that we can offer discounts for BIPOC to access the facilities and to organize affinity nights. Our last event was a dedicated BIPOC affinity night on Juneteenth, where the whole gym was open only to BIPOC for a portion of the day, where BIPOC had free admission, free gear and bike rentals, and free beginner riding and climbing clinics, as well as a free raffle. It was multi-generational, with many families joining us, a DJ, and even a food truck. We had 95 people show up. We also helped to organize a free clinic on beginner mountain biking skills and mindfulness this past weekend, which was taught by 2 professional mountain bike instructors, one of whom is also a therapist. And as we grow, we're planning additional events through the nonprofit Asheville on Bikes to create accessible affinity spaces for urban riding in town as well. Last December, we organized an affinity ride at Fire Mountain on the Kuala boundary in collaboration with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. We offered 3 ride levels for folks depending on skill level, and it was a beautiful opportunity for Black riders, Indigenous riders, and other riders of color to create community. All of this has been possible thanks to community, to folks coming together to share their skills, their expertise, and resources, but also to the BIPOC who have trusted us enough to keep coming back to these spaces to connect and ride with us. As I'll be sharing through the presentation, community is key. It is what makes these spaces happen, and it is an essential part of the healing that can happen on bikes and in affinity spaces. So let's start talking about mountain biking for physical and mental health. Most of us know about the general benefits of cycling for both our physical and our mental health, especially if you've been riding for some time. Endorphins are released that make us feel good. We may experience improved sleep, stress relief, improvements in mood, increased energy and stamina, increased interest in sex, reduced tiredness, more mental alertness. We can access a flow state and a presence that helps us to momentarily forget the weight and the pain of everyday life, and might even help us process it. We can develop a sense of self-efficacy, which is a fancy therapist talk for feeling capable of doing hard things. We can feel like we have achieved something after a bike ride, because we have. Cycling can be a beautiful escape. An important added bonus of mountain biking is that when we ride, we tend to be in nature, and the physical and mental benefits of spending time outdoors and in wild spaces have also been thoroughly documented in scholarly research, though you've all probably felt it yourselves. I'll be touching on this in more depth in a few minutes. I want to add an important note here. We have been told repeatedly that exercise can be extremely beneficial to preventing and alleviating the symptoms of chronic illness, such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and even cancer. And this is true. But as I will discuss later, it is disingenuous not to acknowledge the enormous impact of epigenetics on the prevalence of these conditions among BIPOC populations. Environmental factors, such as racial trauma, can impact gene expression and have a lasting impact over generations. So, what is racial trauma? Before we keep going, we're going to take a quick pause. I want to acknowledge that while this information will likely not be new, hearing about it might be activating. So I want to take a pause, much like a pause we might take while mountain biking in the woods when we approach a feature that is intimidating, like a particularly steep rock section, a rock garden, a drop, or a skinny, like the one you see on screen now. So what do you tend to do when you approach an intimidating feature? Do you ride around it automatically if there's a ride around? Do you stop, get off your bike, and walk it without another consideration? Do you check it out before deciding whether to ride it? Do you ask to follow someone else's line? Do you session it, riding it repeatedly until you feel more comfortable with it? Do you just clench your jaw, push through the fear, and do your best to get to the other side? Or does it all depend on the day? Noticing your patterns on the bike, the things you automatically do when you approach an intimidating feature, can offer you important insight into how you navigate activation in the rest of your life, as I'll be discussing later on. Through this workshop, I'm going to share with you 3 practices, which are somatic practices, that you can use on the trail or any time that you're feeling activation so that you can return to your body and manage this activation. And the first skill is really just to notice the activation, which often shows up as tension. So for this, a simple body scan will do. There's many ways to do a body scan, some more elaborate than others. One of the ways you can do this is to literally scan your whole body, either from the bottoms of your feet to the top of your head, or vice versa. You can bring attention to each body part and notice what you feel. This could take a while, depending on how detailed you make the scan. And as you move through the different areas of your body, you might notice interesting sensations. Here on the screen is some language that might be used to describe these sensations. Note if any of these words remind you of sensations you might have felt in moments of activation on or off the bike. There are many recorded, guided body scans you can find online. While I find those extremely useful and therapeutic, I don't necessarily recommend a full body scan during a bike ride. Instead, a more brief and targeted way to do a body scan while riding your bike, and yes, you can even do this while actively pedaling, is just noticing places where you're holding tension. You don't need to do anything about the tension when you notice it, but perhaps just by bringing attention to it, you can actively release or relax that part of your body. So here are some ideas to do a quick body scan while you're riding your bike. And yes, you may already recognize some of these as part of your patterns of activation on the bike, or you may not. How tightly are you gripping your handlebars? Are you feeling tension in your arms, or are they relaxed but active? Are you clenching your jaw? Do you notice tension in your back or your neck? Can you wiggle your fingers and toes? How's your breathing? As we continue through the workshop, I'm going to encourage you to track sensations in your body, especially if you start noticing activation. Noticing the details of your sensation may give you clues about what you may need in that moment, even if it's just a big, deep breath, or perhaps stepping away from your computer for a second. Don't worry, this workshop is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch later. Other ways you may notice activation can include sudden changes in temperature, sudden changes in your breathing, clammy hands, and tunnel vision. Okay. So there's the questions. And now, what is racial trauma? Within the mental health fields, we talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We think about PTSD as the psychological and physiological remnants of an event or a series of events that overwhelmed us because they were too much, too soon, too fast, or for too long, and left an imprint on our brains and nervous systems. We get stuck reliving these events in our bodies as if they were still happening when we experience triggers that we may or may not be conscious of. You may have heard about the fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. These are the patterns we can get stuck in when we experience trauma, and the patterns we return to when something reminds us of the trauma, whether we are aware of it or not. It is precisely because so much of these physiological processes happens beyond our cognitive awareness that it is so important to work with our nervous systems and our bodies to unravel the hold of trauma on our bodily systems. In a fundamental way, healing from post-traumatic stress disorder entails shifting our relationships to those past events, unraveling those automatic patterns, and developing a capacity to return to the relative safety of the present moment so that we can have more choice about our behaviors, our reactions, and how we engage with the world. As a somatic therapist, I do most of this work by helping clients tap into the resource that is their body, helping them to reconnect and communicate with their nervous system. Noticing activation and deepening our capacity to access a sense of relative safety is key. Racial trauma is different because we live within a culture of white supremacy. I appreciate the way that Resmaa Menakem talks about racial trauma, not as a post-traumatic event, but as a consistent, pervasive, and ongoing traumatic stress disorder. Racial trauma cannot be healed by shifting our relationship to traumatic past events to access relative safety in the present moment because Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color often do not experience relative safety in the world, especially in predominantly white spaces and institutions. We cannot begin to address racial trauma until we are willing to acknowledge the ongoing stress of racism on our bodies and minds, much of which has accumulated genetically over generations. I want to point out here that the experiences of Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color are vastly different. And this is why the acronym I use, BIPOC, separates those groups, because their lived experiences of racial trauma are often qualitatively different. I also want to add that it is essential to keep in mind other intersections of oppression when thinking about consistent, pervasive, and ongoing quality of racial trauma. People with disabilities, poor people, trans people, queer people, fat people who also live in racialized bodies will experience unique and likely more devastating effects of racial trauma. So, how can playing bikes help us to navigate the often inescapable attack and trauma of white supremacy? Before we get into that, let's take another pause to learn one more simple somatic exercise to notice our bodies and practice tending our nervous systems. Because some of us may have experienced activation while very briefly and admittedly superficially unpacking racial trauma. Orienting to the space is a simple practice by which we can signal to our nervous system that we are in a relatively safe space. I use the words relative safety intentional. First of all, as I have just been explaining, absolute safety for BIPOC living in a white supremacist system does not actually exist a vast majority of the time. Moreover, if we think about mountain biking, we also cannot ever guarantee safety, as it is a risky sport that does entail a level of risk at all times. So I use the words relative safety to describe a felt sense that we are not in active danger. What orienting does is it helps us to communicate to our nervous system that it is okay to settle. When we notice activation and there is no active danger, and it is helpful to settle, settling our nervous system can help us to think more clearly and act more intentionally. So we orient by literally looking around us and noticing that we are in a space of relative safety. I invite you to orient to the space that you're in right now, in which you can hopefully find a sense of relative safety, especially if you have noticed any activation has come up for you. So just look around. The key is to look around and notice. Where are the windows? Where are the doors? Actually turn your head to the back so that your eyes can scan the whole environment. You might notice interesting objects, colors, or textures in your environment. It is very important not to make stories about the things your eyes settle on, because getting into stories about particular objects or the memories that a particular color might evoke will bring us back to cognitive processing. What we are trying to do is communicate directly with our nervous system. The senses are the language of the nervous system, after all. So if you have been orienting to your space, take a moment to notice if anything shifted in your body or in your nervous system. Perhaps you notice a settling, perhaps you don't. This is all information for you about you. As I will share later, it is this kind of learning ourselves that is a key to our healing and to preventing future harm by accessing a deeper knowing about what we need in each moment. So, mountain biking and orienting to the outdoors. What are some of the ways that mountain biking can be supportive to the mental health of BIPOC in particular, given the unique nature of racial trauma, which is consistent, pervasive, and ongoing? First, spending time in nature gives us ample opportunity to orient to spaces of safety. This may not always be the case initially, and it is important to remember that fact if you're ever inviting BIPOC into wild spaces. Many BIPOC have had experiences where they were either implicitly or explicitly made to feel as if they do not belong in the outdoors. I will also share that I personally did not find a sense of safety and comfort in nature and in the woods until I was in my 20s, due to my own history. I come from Colombia, and growing up in Bogota in the 90s meant growing up in the midst of a civil war that made rural spaces unsafe. Going to nature could get you kidnapped or killed. And so it took a lot of time and tender care from friends inviting me to spend time outside before I could access that sense of relative safety while being outdoors. Once you find it, though, it is a powerful thing. I hope that each of you has found a sense of peace in your time outside. And if you have not yet, that you soon find it. Orienting to relative safety in nature can be as simple as noticing the leaves of the trees dancing in the wind, the colors of the leaves, and the way they glimmer in the dappled sunlight, or the leafless branches that reveal vast scenery. Orienting to safety might mean noticing the sounds of birds or of rushing water nearby. It might also be the sound of the tires on the loamy dirt or the crunch of rocks. Notice now if there were any changes in your body or your nervous system from hearing those descriptions. I also want to acknowledge that the sensations I associate with mountain biking come from riding in Appalachia, in the subtropical rainforests that are rich, lush, and wet. So perhaps think of what your senses might take in on one of your rides. Practice this noticing of what brings peace and comfort because it can be absolutely instrumental as we navigate the world beyond the trails. Not only are we better resourced and recharged to return to our daily lives, as we gain deeper understanding of what is soothing and comforting to our nervous systems, we might make more room for these things in our lives and prioritize tending ourselves. Living in a capitalist system means we often fall into the grind of going and doing all the things that need to get done. Slowing down to notice what feels good, to learn what feeds us, to settle, is a direct challenge to a system that only demands productivity from us, and especially from BIPOC. So now, alternating stimulation for trauma. So if you've ever heard of eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, then you've heard of another way that cycling can be particularly helpful for addressing the impact of trauma. Researchers have found that alternating right side and left side brain stimulation via visual, auditory, or tactile experiences helps facilitate emotional processing. The back and forth can help us access both hemispheres of the brain in order to more effectively and efficiently process trauma. This can be done visually by following an object with your eyes back and forth as you process the trauma verbally, auditorily by listening to bilateral music therapy that alternates from one ear to the other, or by textile experiences such as cross-body tapping or riding a bike. Perhaps you have already had the experience of thinking through problems, conflicts, or situations that were really difficult to navigate otherwise and shifted dramatically over the course of just one bike ride. Titration. Titration is another fancy therapy term that is used to describe the cycle of activation and settling. In this image, the gray line represents the natural activation and settling cycle. We need activation in life just as much as we need settling. Both are healthy parts of life. Trauma is a little bit different. Trauma happens when we are overwhelmed by too much, too soon, too fast, or too long. Too much activation will put us over the dotted line, outside of our window of tolerance. This is represented by the orange line that goes up and stays up. Overwhelm can get us stuck in hyperarousal, which can look like the fight or flight response and might feel like high levels of anxiety, rage, being on alert, or even panic all the time. We may overreact. We may do things we later regret. we may not make the most supportive choices. When our bodies have been in hyperarousal for too long, or if the overwhelm is too much for our system, our bodies might shut down instead, as represented by the orange line that falls below the dotted line. Shutdown is the freeze response, where we might dissociate, have too little energy, feel lethargic, depressed, sleepy. The freeze response is our system's attempt at managing the overwhelm. Being stuck in either hyperarousal or shutdown means we might struggle with self-regulation and responding with the appropriate level of activation for whatever situation we are in. In this context, it is also important to note that self-regulation does not mean simply calming down or settling so we can tolerate more, but rather self-regulation is the ability to move between states of activation in a way that is flexible and makes sense within the context that we're in. For example, achieving a state of total calm would not necessarily be helpful when you're riding a bike in the woods, or flying a kite, or going to a dance party, or running away from real danger. Activation in itself is not bad, but rather an essential part of life. The key then is to have choice in the level of activation and the actions that we take. To have capacity to be more intentional with the ways that we respond and engage in different situations. Titration is the practice of approaching activation without becoming overwhelmed and retaining our capacity to settle in a way that is appropriate to the context so we can make more intentional choices. I think that it is important to point out one significant way that living in a white, supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal society can impede our capacity for titration and make it more difficult to notice activation and listen to the language of our nervous system. Most of us have been taught from an early age to disconnect from our bodies, and this makes it more difficult to notice and manage activation. We've been taught to disconnect from our bodies when, in school, eating and using the bathroom were only allowed on someone else's schedule. When we were expected to sit still, be quiet, and listen, regardless of what our bodies might need. When we were taught to prioritize urgency and productivity above the bodily needs that might actually be asking for rest and unwinding. If to be successful is to achieve, dissociating from our bodies is often an effective strategy to get the job done. Dissociation may also have been the survival strategy for generations and generations of ancestors living under the yoke of white supremacy. Leaving our bodies, dissociating to survive, might be a strategy passed down through the generations via genetic encoding. Dissociation and disconnection from ourselves and from that inner knowing, that gnawing, that something is wrong or messed up, is also a way in which white supremacy culture keeps us chained and gaslit. Learning to listen to our bodies and trusting them is a powerful tool for preventing the gaslighting that tries to convince us, for example, that microaggressions are not a big deal, or that we may be overreacting to a situation that is actually absolutely outrageous. So now, before we get into how all of this relates back to bikes, let us take a moment to learn and practice one last somatic skill. Let's notice your jaw. You may be holding some tension in the jaw after this last segment. You may not be. The exercise I'm about to show you can be helpful for releasing tension in the jaw. But I have found it is also effective when we experience the proverbial knot in the throat, like something is stuck, or when we feel the urge to scream and rage, but it may not be supportive or safe to do so in the moment. In order to do this exercise, all we need to do is open and close the jaw as slowly as absolutely possible, like so. As you open and close, notice any changes in sensation in your jaw, your tongue, or other parts of your body. You may also notice places where there's a bit more resistance and where it is more difficult to move the jaw. Instead of pushing through these places, stay there and notice what happens. Notice what happens if you slow down the movement even more. The movements can be subtle and small, but they can make an enormous difference. As you release the jaw, you may start yawning. Yawns, much like burps, stretches, and sometimes even sneezes, are ways for our body to release tension accumulated in the nervous system. Okay, so we went through releasing the jaw. Now we're going to talk about titration on bikes. Mountain biking can give us the opportunity to practice titration, or this cycle of noticing activation and settling with relation to something less overwhelming than our personal, historical, or ancestral traumas. Seeing a big, intimidating feature will be activating, but often in a way that is much more manageable than talking about a traumatic experience. The feature is tangible, outside of ourselves, and can give us perspective on our activation. We can literally, physically approach it on foot, then walk our bikes towards it, maybe ride our bikes towards it, or not. Once we notice the activation, we can also notice what helps us to settle. And the more we practice this cycle of encountering activation and settling, which is titration, without becoming overwhelmed, the easier it gets to notice and navigate it. We have more capacity for self-regulation and to make intentional choices. This ability to notice activation as information about us, how we feel about our environment, and how we want to engage with it, as well as how to settle when appropriate, is a translatable skill. As it gets easier on the bike, we might have a greater capacity for it in the rest of our lives. It is by establishing a deeper and more nuanced communication with our nervous systems and our own cycles of activation and settling that we can begin to unravel the hold of personal, historical, and generational trauma, as well as supporting gaslighting prevention. Mountain biking is especially well equipped to offer us a way to develop this deeper and more nuanced form of communication with our bodies while having fun in the woods on bikes with friends. Which brings me to affinity spaces. Affinity spaces are usually organized around particular identities so that folks participating in these spaces have shared or at least parallel experiences. I'm going to be speaking specifically about BIPOC affinity spaces, as that is where I have spent much of my time. And it is the central means by which writing in color seeks to build community and help BIPOC develop a sense of belonging on bikes and in the woods. As I have mentioned before, I do not refer to affinity spaces as safe spaces. I don't think perfectly safe places exist. Besides, I think it is dishonest to promise safety. We cannot guarantee physical safety in mountain biking, for starters. But we also always run the risk that someone will make a mistake or cause harm emotionally or psychologically. I've also heard the term brave spaces, but I also dislike the term because, in a way, BIPOC need to be brave to face the world every single day when they enter predominantly white spaces. But I do think that affinity spaces can be spaces of accountability and relative safety. If we set certain expectations and set a certain kind of tone, these spaces can be created in a way that is supportive, and that is of utmost importance. When we make mistakes, we need to hold ourselves accountable for the impact of our actions and our words, not their intent. And we need to offer this kind of accountability for folks joining us. We also need to be aware of what values we are holding up. How are we approaching the white supremacist imperatives of achievement, performance, and urgency? Yes, we can definitely show up to ride hard and push ourselves, but can there also be room to rest, recover, and to connect? Are these spaces trauma informed in that they remind folks that they always have choice? And is there a culture of consent? Are we supporting and celebrating each other? Literally cheering each other on? Affinity spaces are powerful because all of this deep work of returning to ourselves is happening in community, a community you can take with you, a community that is there to help you through co-regulation. Resma once said during one of our trainings that an individual response to communal horror is inadequate. And this is true. Many BIPOC come from peoples who have been enslaved, colonized, brutalized. Healing this communal trauma requires communal healing. It is in togetherness that we can co-regulate and navigate activation and settling with the support of our community. It is in togetherness that we can share and process activation, both about the features that we ride together and about the rest of our lives. Affinity spaces can offer a container where we can do the hard work of titration, of activation and settling, and learning to listen to our nervous system in a very special way, because there's one less form of activation for us to deal with, the kind of activation that is understandably present in predominantly white spaces. I have experienced and have heard about similar experiences from many BIPOC that there's a particular kind of settling that happens in affinity spaces, a deeper quiet through which we can better listen to ourselves. I didn't even know that it was possible, and it is hard to explain if you have not experienced it yourself. The kind of quiet for our nervous system that is available in affinity spaces is beautiful, but I want to be very honest about something here. It will not make things easier out in the world because it will for sure expand your capacity to feel more and to feel more deeply. I have experienced a dropping of walls that I didn't know existed, which made every microaggression that much sharper. And I want to highlight that this work is even more impactful when it is complemented by the support of a professional that can offer therapeutic support. And I know that I'm saying that as a therapist. But this is especially helpful if the professional is well versed in anti-oppression work. But a deeper feeling and a more tuned capacity to listen to our nervous system are precisely what can help us to prevent cultural gaslighting, what can help us to recognize what feeds us and what doesn't, what we can tolerate and what we don't want to tolerate anymore, when and how to engage, and when it may be a waste of our time. A reconnection to ourselves, that deeper listening, can help us better care for ourselves despite the white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchal imperative that tries to convince us that we don't matter. As Audre Lorde said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Resma talks about the importance of taking on racial trauma one tiny little bit at a time. If dissociation has been a survival strategy, learning to feel and connect with ourselves might be overwhelming in and of itself at first. And so it is key to do it in small doses, to keep it light, and engage in this process with the support of a community. What better way to do this work then than on a bike, in the woods, in the relative safety of an intentionally held affinity space that centers our joy and connection. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Hello.
Hi.
Oh my gosh. That was amazing. I just thank you for taking the time to make sense of this in a way that's like really easily digestible, and also having us kind of practice some of these methods in real time, because it's one thing to say like, yeah, just make sure you like release your jaw sometimes. do that. But to actually sit there and show like how you would go through that process was very helpful. For me, this is particularly great just because I'm new to mountain biking. I've just kind of gotten really into it in the last year. And so I'm really soaking this all in. But I think even for folks who are really experienced mountain bikers, or even folks who don't ride mountain bikes, they just like to ride bikes in the city, or or for whatever reason, for utilitarian purposes, I think this is still applies to all of that. Like anytime we're moving in a space, I think all of these practices are super important. And feel free, folks who are watching, to drop questions in the chat while we're chatting here. I do have a few questions of my own to start. I think like I kind of want to talk a little bit about the trauma and orienting. I think that's something, like you mentioned, a lot of people are familiar with the mental health of mountain biking and that it makes you feel good. But actually thinking about the other side of the emotions and like the roots of certain emotions and why we might feel certain ways or respond certain ways. I think that's something we can all spend some time on. I think my biggest takeaway from the orienting was like trying to live in the present, being present, which can be really hard to do. We're an evolutionary species and we're real good at avoiding things that have hurt us or others before. So it does kind of feel like a little bit of a hurdle, but I like to remind myself that, it's more important to remember that there was a time, I think, if what we understand of human evolution might be accurate. I don't know. But hopefully there was a time where we were all roaming freely and there weren't social constructs and, human violence that were traumatizing us so much to make us feel restrained. I know that I've been able to kind of overcome that a little bit and have the courage to like step out of my comfort zone. But I know for my family, most of them being Black and seeing things like with Ahmaud Arbery and all that, like it's very hard for them to be at all inclined to like get on a bike and go outside or even go for a hike. They are like, oh, what you're doing is wild. You kind of touched a little bit on like trying to bring people to places that can make them feel relatively more safe. And do you have any tips for like encouraging folks who are timid about like trying new outdoor things?
Well, first I want to address something that you mentioned about avoidance. And like, I guess a lot of what I see in like the mental health community nowadays is that avoidance is bad and we should be present all the time. And I think that's just wrong because avoidance is a survival strategy. Life can get really overwhelming sometimes, and avoidance is absolutely a coping mechanism. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not, right? And so what I'm kind of advocating for here is notice the urge to avoid and be curious about it. And then you have a choice. I'm noticing the urge to avoid. In this moment, is it helpful to avoid? Maybe it is. Maybe it's actually keeping me from doing the things that are going to help me to feel more alive. And that's a thing that only you can choose for yourself and realize for yourself, right? So avoidance is not inherently bad. It's information. Noticing if I'm the kind of person that like grips the handlebar and just goes through the like really hard thing is just information. And maybe one day I'll be like, actually, this is making me a little unsafe and I don't want to continue with that pattern. Maybe it continues to work for you. As for bringing people outside, this is why I have kind of dedicated myself to creating affinity spaces, to sharing on Instagram about what we do, about the framework that we use to invite people. I like to also share words that like some writers who have participated in events share so that they can speak from their experience. I hear a lot from folks who've been like, I never thought that I would like want to ride bikes, especially in the woods. But community. having a friend that you know, that you trust, be like, hey, I did this thing and it actually felt really good. You know, that's the way. But I think that we just really have to respect the fact that, like, it's just not, it doesn't feel safe and it doesn't feel accessible for a lot of people. So this is going to take time, like shifting people's minds about what might be safe and what might be not. Because on a fundamental level, they're right. It's not always safe.
Yeah. I really like your point about just acknowledging why they're in that headspace of, like, maybe not just being quick to judge of like, why don't you just try this thing? Like, all these other people are doing it. Maybe actually taking this time to be a little bit more considerate as to, like, okay, like, what makes you not want to do it? Or like, what is the apprehension? Or, and either respecting it no matter what, but then giving them the choice of, well, do you want to try to work it out in another way, or do you want to try to, like, see how that feels? Or, if not, that's totally fine.
Yeah.
I
And
think
little bit, like maybe like just test out the bike like around your house and see what that feels like. Or like maybe we'll do a 1 mile ride
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll talk about it, you know? Maybe, so there's like little baby steps that you can take before you're like, let's do a 12-mile ride in a place you've never been to before.
Yeah. Or like completely catching someone by surprise too, where I might think it's a short ride and I think it's chill, but they get there and they're like, whoa, 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 this is,
that's consent, right? We want folks to
yeah.
be able to consent about what they're getting into, and they can't give consent if they don't know what they're getting into.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something I've been learning even with my sister, since we've both moved to Colorado in the last year. And she's wanted to get out more and she likes to, like, take nature walks and things, but there has to be a clear communication of, like, how many hours are we going to be out there? Is there elevation? Like, even, is there a bathroom? Like, even little things like that for, like, comfort. Yeah, there has to be a clear discussion now, which I've learned the hard way, but it's good. I really like, also, kind of, you spoke to how a lot about how community is key and the communal trauma requires communal healing. I can't agree more. Being a part of the Black Foxes has been so magical because I was riding bikes before and I thought it was fun and everything. But I don't think I really started healing how I didn't even realize I needed to until I started taking up space with a group of people that has a shared experience, and, like, without me even having to express it, kind of already knows what my fears are or what my, like, hurdles are with taking up this space. So it's been really impactful. So I highly recommend, like, if you're somebody who, is apprehensive, or you feel like, maybe you're getting bored with bikes or just outdoor recreation, I feel like finding like-minded folks um, is worth a shot to see if you can get more out of it. Um, Although, on the other side of that coin, I will say we do have instances where non-BIPOC folks, like either white or white passing folks, will ask, are they welcome in this space? Can they interact with us? And sometimes I like to think, I think it's important for us to have our own affinity spaces for, like, similar identifying, similar experiencing people. But I like to think that occasionally integrating, just so that those people, white people and non-BIPOC folks, can actually experience kind of what our boundaries are in a space that's prioritizing us. But I do find it hard to balance that, because I want everyone to learn and I want everyone to be able to grow and be better people and comfort one another and heal. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know if we're quite in that space yet to be able to do that. And especially trying to protect other folks. I do wonder if you have any thoughts on that, if you had similar experience with the writing in color group. If not, it's totally fine. But I just wonder if you have any experience with that.
Yeah. A lot of the experience has been actually white folks being very offended that this is an affinity space. And sometimes when there's questions, I will, offer answers. I feel like part of like crafting this space is being able to offer education. And as like, because of my proximity to whiteness, I feel like because of my privilege, I should, do a lot more educating than other folks participating in this space. But often there's not a question, there's just an attack because segregation and they're feeling excluded. And I don't really engage with the attacks. If they're not seeking to understand, I don't really engage. When we have done events, for example, the BIPOC mechanic classes, the beginner clinics that happened last weekend, those were led by white people. But those are white people that either I or other folks in the leadership team of Writing in Color know personally, have been working with for a while, trust to have been doing their own work around their whiteness. And so we specifically let people know that these are BIPOC centered spaces, but not BIPOC affinity spaces, so that they know what they're walking into, right? And so that has been kind of the extent to which we've invited allies into the space. Are you here to like offer your expertise, your time, your skills? Like, please come and share. But we haven't really done too much to like open our spaces for the benefit of like white folks learning about our boundaries, because it feels like the affinity spaces that we want to be cultivating are for the BIPOC people and for their experience. So far, that's kind of how we've navigated that, but we're still trying to learn how to do things.
Same. Yeah, I think that's really awesome how y'all are going about it. It's very similar for me as well. And same thing, like if it's an attack, I'm kind of like, well, you don't have to hang out here. There are billions of people on this planet. There are thankfully many places to recreate for now. So, you know, if it's not if we ain't jiving, that's fine. You can go your own way. Um, and I definitely don't want to take energy away from folks or make them feel like they're having to educate and they're having to train folks when they're just trying to have fun.
Right.
That's definitely, what I don't want to happen.
And I will add that, like, for me, I have a history of being a people pleaser and wanting things to like feel good and avoiding conflict. So a past version of Diana would have tried to explain, but because I've been doing this like nervous system regulation and I noticed the activation, the fawn response, the wanting to make everything okay and explain things away, I'm like, oh, I noticed that urge and it's going to be a waste of my time.
Ooh,
So
yeah.
I noticed the urge. It's an interesting urge. It comes from a place of wanting to stay safe in places where I don't feel safe by over explaining. And I'm not going to over explain and waste my energy in that way. So that's one way where like learning about my own nervous system gives me choice in what I do and what I don't do, and what labor I offer and what labor I don't.
Yeah. I love that. I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try to take that on. Yeah, I've definitely better about that. I think transitioning from working in a like the service industry where a lot of the people I was serving were definitely activating that kind of response for me. And so being able to transition from that, I've been able to kind of heal and kind of rewire myself a little bit, and have be able to place better boundaries. Um, we are losing time, but I do have one more question, which hopefully won't take too long to talk about. I'd love to talk about it forever, but um, being, I love the work that you're doing, And I'm really excited to hear about, like, for myself to kind of go down the rabbit hole of somatic therapy and everything. And I know that, well, I'm assuming, because I know this is true in other therapeutic practices, but there isn't a ton of diversity in terms of practicing therapists. If there's somebody who's listening who might actually be interested in pursuing that, do you have any recommendations of where they can start um, to try to get into that industry?
So in order to become a somatic practitioner, if you're like a therapist and you want to get training and you're a BIPOC person, I'm actually doing the Somatic Experiencing Practitioner training through Somatic Experiencing International in the BIPOC cohort. I highly recommend it. The instructors are BIPOC, the assistants are BIPOC, all participants are BIPOC, and to be able to sit there and have conversations around ancestral trauma, but also like the legacy that our ancestors left us, to be able to like thrive, it's just a completely different like ball game. So BIPOC affinity spaces are the way to go. I have been in white spaces as part of my training as well, and it was too activating for me to take as much away from that. If you're not like a therapist or a massage therapist or someone who is in kind of that therapeutic role, the Education for Racial Equity is like an organization that Resma Menakem started. I actually have his book right here, My Grandmother's Hands. He is also a somatic experiencing practitioner. He's kind of like the father of somatic abolitionism, which is essentially a practice dedicated to healing racial trauma from a somatic perspective. They do different kinds of trainings that are not specifically for therapists, so they're just kind of for the general population to go and with him practice noticing. It's powerful work. Right now I'm doing the communal consultations program, which is a 9-month program where we meet and we take little sips, because this is big, 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 big stuff. And we get to play with the tools, or as he likes to call them, toys, to be able to like settle ourselves and be able to access the noticing without becoming overwhelmed.
Ooh, okay. Ooh, that's powerful. Thank you for that resource or resources. Yeah. Okay. With that, hopefully that is useful to. I'm hoping there's somebody out there who's like, you know what, I could get into that. I'm really hoping, because we definitely need more of it. I know for me personally, that would fill my cup. Um, and with that, I would love to thank you for your time, you and our awesome interpreters, for telling a story and educating us on something that is, I think, going to be is infinitely important. It's a timeless conversation. I really look forward to seeing where you go with it, and I'll hit you up if I'm in North Carolina.
You do. Thank you.
And what was that?
Thank you for having me, and thank you
Of
to the
course.
interpreters too.
Of course. And for folks who want to support Deanna, you can find the Writing in Color WNC group on Instagram here. And this is the counseling services that they're associated with. So feel free to check that out and support them those ways. And if you miss this live and you're just catching the end of it, or whatever, this will live on the YouTube channel along with all of the other workshops that we have done. Feel free to check them out. If you yourself are someone who's interested in leading one, please feel free to reach out to us on our website, aquickbrownfox.com. And we'd like to thank our sponsors, of course, for supporting these workshops. They help us in being able to value our interpreters and presenters appropriately for their time and energy. So with that, I'm going to close out and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.